All I know about music is that not many people ever really hear it. And even then, on the rare occasion when something opens within and the music enters, what we mainly hear, or hear corroborated, are personal, private, vanishing evocations. But the man who creates the music is hearing something else, is dealing with the roar rising from the void, and imposing order on it as it hits the air. What is evoked in him, then, is of another order, more terrible because it has no words, and triumphant too for that same reason. And his triumph, when he triumphs, is ours. Hey, this is Nathan.
This is David.
And this is Nick, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where today we're talking about the short story Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. And so this is a 1950s tale in Harlem, combining elements of race, addiction, and one of my favorite topics, just music writing. So to start it off, David, our question that we ask at the beginning of each episode, is this of substance?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you covered some of the topics, but I think underneath those, there's questions about what role does race play in America? How does addiction work? What are its effects on families, relationships, artistic creation, not just musical creation, I think. I think Baldwin is kind of getting at something about specifically music, but also art in general, and how it can or possibly can redeem somebody. So yeah, I think unequivocally this is a work of substance. Nathan, what do you think?
So I enjoyed this story. I think it was pitched when we decided to read this as a pretty great story, and I enjoyed it okay. So I don't know. I'm not convinced that it's a top tier short story. I didn't not enjoy it, but it didn't really resonate with me in any particular way.
Boo.
I'll just jump in on this and say that I'm probably going to go in the exact opposite direction and out myself as a bit of a Baldwin superfan. I think this is absolutely of substance. I think it's an amazing slice of short fiction or any length fiction or any American writing. Baldwin has so much to do with what I kind of think of as cataloging the American experience. And yes, there's topics of addiction. Yes, there's topics of race. Yes, there's topics of creativity. But, throughout his works, he's really just picking apart what it really means to exist in this country, in his era. And a lot of it is tied to, his upbringing and whatnot. But I think just the humanity that he offers to that experience from so many different directions just absolutely kind of floors me each time. So I am kind of interested to start. I'm just going to go straight back into Nathan's. So kind of for, something that you're a little bit into versus not that into. Is there anything that stood out that just didn't work for you?
No, there's not anything particular. I mean, if I think about, it's a well-written story, and maybe it's a personal thing. There's certainly a lot of subtlety to it, and maybe that's something that the two of you are responding to. I think that for me, I don't know. I mean, in a short story, maybe I wanted more action. I don't know.
There was no explosions
yeah.
in James Baldwin's fiction.
I don't have a particular critique of it. It's it was good, but is it something I'm going to go tell people about and you have to read this? Is it something that I'm still thinking about, after I've read it? Is it something I want to read again? It's good, and it made me want to read more stories in the book, but I hope that he's written something better than this. And I've read things from him that I thought were better than this.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, a more general question. Do short stories have that general effect on you? Because I know for a lot of people, and for me, sometimes that happens where a lot of short stories actually don't resonate as powerfully as a novel does.
Yeah.
So is it brevity? Is it the length? Is it?
I think that there's something to that. I mean, I kind of had a similar feeling with Eileen Chang and the short story we read, Love in a Fallen City. I thought it was okay, but I didn't really get invested into it the way that I did with Naked Earth, which I really loved. So I think that there is something to that. I think maybe this mode of short story, which is kind of I guess it's kind of a vignette, which is kind of like what Eileen Chang's was?
No, I don't think it's a vignette. I think it's very much a narrative. You see a beginning, middle, and end, albeit the end, to me anyway, is ambiguous, which is maybe something we can get to later, but I don't think this is a vignette. You really get an idea of the narrator and Sonny's life. At least I did. I felt like in such a short amount of time, like I got to know these people. And I think that's what helped made it powerful.
Well, I guess what I mean is in the format of a short story, something that's more conceptual maybe resonates with me a little bit more. I don't know. I think probably the short answer is short stories don't really resonate with me that much.
Okay.
You are the conceptual leaning of the crew. Because I mean, I would also argue that, like, in terms of depth per square inch of the page, that Baldwin really does fill it out. And so if we actually kind of sort of recap the story itself, you have a Harlem school teacher whose younger brother has been picked up for doing heroin, and it kind of goes back into different stories of their past, both from what their parents have faced growing up as African Americans in the U.S., and then also sort of stories as to how he and his brother went in different paths. Narrator became a school teacher. The brother sort of was a little bit more erratic, joined the Navy, was into drugs, and ultimately became a accomplished musician. And so it kind of goes back through and ultimately, I think, ends up at this topic that I am always a huge fan of in literature, is just the idea of suffering. Why do we do it? What's the point? Who goes through it? Are people susceptible? Do people seek it out? And sort of that question is sort of deliberated by the narrator in Sonny's last performance at the end of the story. And for roughly, 40-some pages, I actually, like I said before, was just really into the amount of ground that he covered and the amount of emotion that he crammed into all those pages.
Yeah, I think you touched on a key word here, which is suffering. Granted, this entire narrative is filtered through this one man's perspective, but you get a sense not only of his own view of the world, but it really comes across as a desperate and bleak place and a bleak time. This might be his perception based on what he's going through himself, but all of the characters have this darkness and this suffering about them, and a lot of it is about how they deal with it.
You would say that's true of the narrator?
Yeah, there's something really unassuming about this narrative and this narrator. Through the narrative, you come to see how he views the world and how he views people. So at the very opening, it's him leaving the school grounds, and he describes the children in the classroom. He describes this other junkie who comes to give him the news, but really is just to get a couple of bucks off of him. He describes this woman in a bar, and each of his descriptions, you get a sense of his worldview. So let me just read a couple of them. So this first one comes right on, at least on my edition, the very first page, where he's thinking about his brother and thinking about the age that his brother is compared to the boys in his classroom. And he's talking about the first time Sonny used heroin. Right, so he says, "I was sure that the first time Sonny had ever had horse, he couldn't have been much older than these boys were now. These boys now were living as we'd been living then. They were growing up with a rush, and their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. They were filled with rage. All they really knew were two darknesses, the darkness of their lives, which was now closing in on them, and the darkness of the movies, which had blinded them to that other darkness, and in which they now vindictively dreamed, at once more together than they were at any other time, and more alone." Man, that's a good passage right there.
Whew.
It's short, and it gives you so much to think about. At least it does to me anyway.
Yeah, I agree. That specific line about butting up against the ceiling of what was actually possible, that alone to me just sort of explains what the narrator's way of dealing with things is, which is he's very frank. He's trying to make sense of it, but he's really not. He has no optimism whatsoever. He's seeing all of these things, and he navigates them on a daily basis. He's had to deal with all of these things, and he's still trying to make a go at it, but his life is also sort of inherently limited as well. And I think he struggles with that, and I think that's that's his way of suffering that he doesn't call out as openly and directly and as much of an artist wants to speak as suffering as Sonny does.
He seems to be very much a pragmatist.
Yes, he's working with what he has.
I mean, I see that he sees the world around him as bleak. I didn't get the feeling that he saw his life necessarily as bleak. I don't have anything to reference specifically, but I got the impression that he saw it as like he judged Sonny harshly.
Yeah.
Until
Absolutely.
until the end. And Sonny, who he thinks made all the wrong decisions and didn't deal with life pragmatically. And so to me, we're talking about his worldview. It seems to me that he thinks like, yeah, there's suffering, but deal with it practically and you'll get as far as you might. Don't expect more than is possible. Obviously that's contrasted with Sonny, who wants life in its totality, and that leads to his destruction.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, but there's also a couple of examples where he puts himself on the same level as Sonny. And so I'm going to read one. It's kind of longer, but I think it shows some of this. So he's talking about the trap of Harlem. He says, "Some escaped the trap, most didn't. Those who got out always left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in the trap. It might be said, perhaps, that I had escaped. After all, I was a school teacher, or that Sonny had. He hadn't lived in Harlem for years. Yet, as the cab moved uptown through streets which seemed, with a rush, to darken with dark people, and as I covertly studied Sonny's face, it came to me that what we were both seeking through our separate cab windows was the part of ourselves which had been left behind. It's always at the hour of trouble and confrontation that the missing member aches." So he's kind of putting themselves on similar plane. Now, I don't think he agrees with, the approach of Sonny, and he's picked apart Sonny in a million different ways. He's kind of a faux father figure. The idea of being a musician, like all of this stuff, he attaches that level of pragmatism that you were talking about, Nathan. But I think he also sort of has some questions for himself that he almost doesn't allow himself to directly talk about, but that with all of these indications that he gives throughout the narrative, that they're definitely in there.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really enjoy hearing the two of you talk about it because, like, you're reading these passages and you're bringing up these points. I'm like, yeah, I guess I did read that, and I don't know, maybe I just need more time to marinate with it, and like when it's over and you haven't sat with it long enough, maybe it just hasn't struck you.
I mean, this is the underlying.
I do have a very strong feeling about who these people are, and like Baldwin's ability to make it feel so real without you ever doubting, that he made these people up or hitting you over the head with like what he's trying to say. Like you just know what he's getting at.
Yeah. So, I mean, the passage that you read there reminds me of, the expression, and you can fill it in for any city, but you can take the man out of Harlem, but you can't take the Harlem out of the man, right? So for whatever city you fill that into, it's about, okay, so Baldwin does this thing where he captures humanity on a greater scale, but also on a very specific place. He's battling with this nature versus nurture and showing that it's both. And he really captures how a city or a surrounding or a community and how you grow up there really can affect a person. And a lot of his reminiscing of childhood, talking about, there's this one passage, I couldn't find it because I forgot to mark it, but it's after church on some weekend. All the kind of elderly people of the community are sitting around with children on their lap, and they're all not speaking because they're kind of sitting in this silence and thinking about suffering, right? And they don't want to bother the children. There's some children falling asleep. Do you guys remember that passage, what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I actually noted it.
I've got it right here if you want me to read it.
Go for it.
Or do you want to read it? We're going to read it together, challenge.
We'll read it in tandem. No.
So the passage you're talking about is, so maybe a kid is lying on the rug, half asleep. Maybe somebody's got a kid in his lap and is absent-mindedly stroking the kid's head. Maybe there's a kid, quiet and big-eyed, curled up in a big chair in the corner. The silence, the darkness coming, and the darkness in the faces frightens the child obscurely. He hopes that the hand which strokes his forehead will never stop, will never die. He hopes that there will never come a time when the old folks won't be sitting around the living room talking about where they've come from and what they've seen and what's happened to them and their kinfolk. And then it kind of goes on to just sort of line up the setting sun and like the oncoming darkness, like with that backing feeling. And that's kind of just like also just the arc of the story. It's the arc of life. It's all of that. And he has so many different moments where he inserts that entire spectrum in a really small observation.
And that passage does something else that I think Baldwin does amazing, and that's he writes in a way that mirrors part of what the story is about, which is music, right? So that passage builds the way a good song will progress, right? This repetition of maybe, 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 then he leaps from silence to silence, darkness to darkness, and then the hope to hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the transitions from memory to present tense to past tense, I think is quite smooth the way he does it.
Nathan has a skeptical look on his face. Is that skepticism?
I'm
just going to call you out all episode. How about that?
Well, it'd be skepticism if I was more confident in myself. I just feel confused. I feel like I need to reread this.
Just get back in there. How many times did you read it? Once?
Once. I just read it through once.
Okay.
See, and I think this is something I was talking to Nathan with before we started recording, but this story was the first short story that I read in high school that really, really opened me up to short fiction. I think I read it when I was a sophomore in high school or something. And it was the first story that didn't feel like this very forced lesson to be learned kind of thing. It was something very honest and raw and dealt with difficult things. You know, for the most part, like when I was really young, up until I was about 13, 14, I never really read all that much until I took a couple of classes and got into short fiction. And this was one of the sort of springboards that got me into reading all kinds of different fiction. So I have this attachment to the story, I think. I've read it probably 5 or 6 times in my life. At least.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I think that's kind of an awesome insight because, you know, I've probably read this 2 or 3 times in the last 2 months, right? So I don't have that same own historical attachment and narrative associated with it. But you know, I kind of made this comment earlier in the episode just about music writing, and you referenced the way his prose sort of lines up with the song, and that's totally what I feel, especially when he is actually talking about the musical set itself. And he touches on so many things that I think are just obvious to people who are always struggling with these aspects of creativity, but especially live music and the ability to have it ebb and flow and to have a set that maybe is bombing and then something shifts in the mood or the energy and then, you know, it dives in a totally different direction. And while maybe very little has changed at face value, everything has changed. And so his way of running through that over the last, you know, maybe quarter of the story, outside of all of these topics of suffering and, you know, race and addiction and stuff, was just kind of a brilliant, understanding of how all this stuff works. And even that just kind of left me floored. So I don't know, I've just gotten really into Baldwin. I love how he writes about the city. I love how he writes about creativity. I love how he writes about incredibly difficult topics that people are really quick to take sides on, and he gives humanity in all directions. And I think that's one of the reasons why Baldwin is still so widely read today, is that very few people have been able to do that on really so many different topics. And, you know, this is kind of just a tiny slice of some of that.
Both of you have spent a fair amount of time writing music, and you both referenced sort of the musical quality of this story, and I wonder if that doesn't play into your appreciation of it more than myself, who's fairly musically
still working on it.
Musically juvenile.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I just, you know, gave 20-minute speech on why that did resonate with me so heavily. But yeah, I can feel that.
I think you can read that as not just simply about music. So the ending is, I think, there is obviously a love for music and a love for jazz in particular, but there's also the narrative, which is something we didn't really talk about, which is the brotherly relationship, right? I don't know if you two, I know Nathan's got a brother. Nick, do you got a brother?
I've got a brother.
You got a brother? So I don't know if you guys noticed, but the flashback scene where they're talking in the kitchen right after their mother dies, I don't know if you've had conversations like that with your brothers, if you have younger brothers or older brothers, but man, you can tell Baldwin has had conversations similar to these. I've been in kitchens having conversations about responsibility and growing up, both receiving them and giving them. So it felt very realistic. And in the end, you see this brother trying to understand his sibling and kind of look for the sense of redemption that Sonny might find in his artistic endeavor.
Which conversation was this?
This was... Wait, sorry, go ahead.
I was just say the one where he's crushing the beer can the whole time.
So there's that one, and then there's the one that's the flashback of after the mother dies, and the narrator has just got back from the army and is asking Sonny what he wants to do with his life and how he has to go live with his fiance's family, the narrator's fiance's family.
Right.
Do you remember this? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like the faux father figure scene of it, right?
Yeah, yeah. And his Sonny keeps saying, like, you're not listening to me. You don't understand what I'm trying to say.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It felt very much like an older brother trying to give advice to his younger brother that didn't really want to listen to it.
And actually, I mean, I have a younger brother, and the relationship between the two of them was probably my favorite thing in the story. And like the narrator trying to be responsible, but kind of like overstepping how much he actually knows. And also his sort of kind of apathy for Sonny. Like it's really well developed, I think. He wants Sonny to do the right thing, but he doesn't really want to get involved because he doesn't actually seem to think that Sonny has what it takes, whatever that is, and doesn't want to be associated with Sonny's failings. And then the way that builds to the end, and probably my favorite passage is sort of when he finally gets what Sonny's about and can kind of forgive all of those things about Sonny that he doesn't like. You know, he sees he sees how Sonny, or you know, in his mind he sees how Sonny, he thinks Sonny's trying to kill himself. And he's like, why is he doing this? Why is he trying to kill himself? Why doesn't he want to live? And then seeing, you know, at the end he finally sees Sonny play music and sees Sonny in his element and kind of has a realization about, you know, just by seeing him involved in this action, has a realization about this way of living that's so foreign to him. And I mean, with siblings, I think it's especially hard, but you know, with anybody, you're like, I just don't understand why you're doing things the way you're doing them. Like, don't you see that this is ruining your life? And that moment for them, when he sort of understands that, I thought it was really powerful.
Well, and it took his own moment of what is something that he doesn't really touch on because he is such a reserved person, is his own suffering at the loss of his daughter, right? He has this one line that just says, "My trouble made his real." And that's such an honest thing, I think, for everybody, right?
Yeah.
This idea of empathy really only works sometimes. I mean, I don't know. This is a tough thing about, we can talk about empathy in fiction as well. Like, does it really work unless you've experienced something akin to it? Can you really feel empathy unless you've gone through suffering of your own in some way?
Yeah. Do you have the dynamic range to even define what that means versus your own spectrum? And I think, yeah, I mean, that one passage about his like 2-year-old daughter dying from, it's polio, right?
Polio, yeah.
Was just, I mean, it's just like a small aside in a paragraph. And that one just was ridiculously emotional. Kind of ends with basically, you know, them trying to push forward, but his wife just being so scarred and you know, the remains that she has to deal with on a regular basis. I think it refers to as like her crying as a mortal wound that he has to fill. And yeah, and I agree, after that, it kind of, maybe it did give him the definition and the understanding of that full spectrum to be able to even leave room to try and, you know, upgrade Sonny from what he probably thought of was a fuck up to, you know, somebody who is actually, you know, capable of humanity and compassion himself.
So we can go two directions here. We can talk about, we've mentioned that this story deals with race, but we really haven't gone into it. I don't know if that's something we want to do or feel that we can do, or we can go to the ending.
I kind of do want to talk about the first one, but maybe not in the way that, you know, I don't necessarily want to dissect it other than maybe just commenting how this, and actually a lot of James Baldwin fiction in general, it just has to be insanely relevant for just offering a window into this and for things that maybe we can all openly admit aren't that different nowadays. And using his fiction as a tool to communicate and to share and to maybe like help develop people's own spectrums and empathy. And I think that is incredibly valuable. And that's kind of my hope, is that people, maybe if this is outside their bounds or usual topics and whatnot, that they'll use it to find ways to relate to the current world around them in directions that weren't really accessible previously.
Yeah, okay. So talking about race with Baldwin, and it's something we talked about a little bit on the supplemental episode with his essay. It's kind of tricky because it is integral to his stories and his narratives, and yet he does talk about these concepts that are universally human, and that's more where the focus is. But race is such a part of the background of these characters' particular environments, particular sufferings, particular histories. It is such a part of these stories, and maybe because I am not a Black American and I don't have that connection, my stronger emotional reactions do come from the greater humanity parts of Baldwin, and the conversations and the way that he deals with race in Harlem, specifically during this time, is where something that we've been talking about is this idea of empathy, where I try and I hope that I get this sense of empathy for what that experience is like, and how that suffering is different and strong and important for what you were talking about, Nick, such a part of American culture and American life. I don't know if any of my rambling just made sense, but
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit. I mean, race is obviously an integral part of this narrative, but I didn't feel like it's not a story about race. I think it reminds me of something that Baldwin said in the documentary, I'm Not Your Negro. The African American story, or the Negro story, is the American story. And I think that sort of mindset comes across to me. Like it's not a story about, as a white man reading a story about African Americans in Harlem, it's not a story about otherness. It's an American story.
you're saying it's integral, but it's not about that. But I think it is about that in some way. It's never, like, the characters never really explicitly talk about it, other than the mother's story of the father's horrific past. Is race really ever talked about? But it's always there.
I think it's a balance. I think it's all of the above, and I think it's integral. I also think it is the topic. I was kind of, my description earlier, I think it actually does help show and add opportunities for empathy for the outside reader, and that's why it's valuable for people of all different backgrounds to be reading this, because it's not the topic of every single page, but it certainly is the reason and background for all of the individual experiences and suffering. And just going back to that quote about children hitting the ceiling of what they can have so early, and they're basically this dichotomy between essentially a life of poverty and just desiring the splendor that's shown from movies and film and showbiz, and basically knowing that you can't ever have it. And so, like, that whole mentality to me is like just pulsing through this whole thing. And I think you can't take race out of that, but I think it's also super identifiable if you don't consider race. And Baldwin, I think he made this comment in some of his essays that we had kind of covered a couple earlier, but just he never really viewed himself as an African-American writer and didn't want to be viewed as that, but he also spent a lot of time, offering views into that experience. And I think that's sort of part of the genius of Baldwin, it is about that, and it's also not about that. And I think that's cool. And that's what I get out of it.
He has a quote, and I'm going to read it to you. I don't know where this comes from, because this is an intro in an anthology that I have. and it's just a little background on Baldwin, and it gives a quote that he said when he's talking about why he became a commuter rather than an expatriate. He said, "Only white Americans consider themselves to be expatriates. Once I found myself on the other side of the ocean, I could see where I came from very clearly, and I could see that I carried myself, which is my home, with me. You can never escape that." And then the last line here, "I am the grandson of a slave, and I am a writer. I must deal with both." That last line really gets at what you're talking about, and I think gets at what Baldwin struggled with.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that quote you read just absolutely, totally encapsulates exactly what I was trying to maybe with all thumbs describe. But yeah, it's a line that is tricky to sort of talk about. I think it's a line that was tricky for Baldwin to walk himself. And when you start to slice apart his different pieces of fiction, whether it's sort of his earlier Go Tell on the Mountain, growing up in Harlem, or some of his later ones that were sort of really about a lot of race stuff in New York City. So Another Country and Going to Meet the Man. But they also, like, again, same sort of comment, they were treating all of these things as sort of just normal pieces of humanity. It's like, how do you elevate it to where it's a thing that people can share and learn from, but also he's trying to not make it the only topic. And his ability to walk that, I think, is pretty brilliant.
I mean, can we tie this back into Sonny's music at the end of the story, where the music isn't about the suffering? The music is about the music, but the music exists because of the suffering. But the ability to sit there without having experienced that suffering and experience the music and have greater empathy for the person who's playing that music. I mean, is that not Baldwin?
It's kind of the universal bridging the gap mentality and basically learning from it, right? Having these experiences that pull you in a certain direction that also ultimately sort of allow you to view yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think did you ask the question just a little while ago about...
Somebody asked the question.
Or David asked the question. A question was posed, can you have empathy if you haven't experienced something directly yourself or have experienced the same thing directly yourself? And I think that this is...
not the same thing, but something
similar.
Akin,
but there's a creative leap that happens, right? Between this thing that I've experienced and this thing that you've experienced that I could say, I feel how you feel. Yeah, I understand that feeling. And I haven't read a lot of Baldwin, but that's one of my favorite things in his writing. It's like, I always feel what he's feeling. And the ability, I mean, even in this story, like Sonny never seemed to me to be a heroin junkie, a stereotype. Sonny was always a human being and always had struggles and family. And I mean, the thought never even entered my mind that I've already made an assumption about this person, which I have. I think we're probably familiar with passing addicts in the street and not feeling empathy for those people, and passing judgment and making assumptions about the choices that led them, to this state. And, that's how we get by in a world where there's so much pain and suffering around us. And it's an amazing feat that Baldwin introduces this character and it never crossed my mind that I'd already made that assumption about who this person was or why they got there. He's human the entire time.
So David, you posed kind of like two branches, and we talked about the first branch. So the second branch would be kind of covering the ending of this. So what are your thoughts with how Baldwin wrapped this up?
I mentioned that I find the ending to be somewhat open-ended or ambiguous, specifically because of Baldwin's introduction of the cup of trembling, which, if you aren't familiar with it, is an allusion to something from the Old Testament. It comes from the book of Isaiah. And this cup represents, God gives this cup to the people of Israel. This cup is full of fear and dread and suffering, which is something we've been talking about a lot in the story. And those that drink from it will continue to sort of suffer this whimsical, unknowable inexplicable pain, more or less. But God also chooses to take it away, which is this sort of relief of suffering. And what I think the way that the narrator describes that cup does a few things. One, it sort of paints him as somewhat of a savior or possible savior figure. That's one way to read it, that the narrator's kind of full of himself, seeing that he can maybe somehow save his brother. Or you can read it in another way, that he just puts it on top of the piano and that the choice is Sonny's, and that you really don't know if Sonny will go clean and will make this music, which the narrator describes so beautifully and so much as a way of escape and release and creation. If Sonny will go into that music, or if he will go back to heroin as a release from the suffering of life. So, did you catch the illusion there? Did you think about it? Did you think it was open-ended, closed? Did you see it as a sort of happy ending, that the brother accepts his brother as who he is and sees this beautiful music as artistic freedom and creation and release and escape? Or how do you read it?
Yeah, I'd say I'll openly admit that illusion went right over my head. Other than the language, to me, a lot of Baldwin's language has always felt like that, partially because he has a background of being a teenage preacher and grew up in the church. So he's got kind of that biblical eloquence through a lot of his works. But yeah, as far as the specific reference, that kind of clears up a lot of stuff for me, or rather gives me the opportunity to think about it in different ways. I really read it as not so much positive, but sort of just a notch that had happened for the brother. He had this experience that allowed him to sort of understand Sonny in a way that he had never allowed himself, and had also never been given the opportunity to. It was sort of both brothers sort of showing themselves to each other, and I thought that was in a way positive. But I also sort of got the impression that he was going to let Sonny be, that this was Sonny, that this was his environment, this is what he wanted to do, and that he was going to kind of take a step back. Now, your point about, is he sort of a godlike figure based on how he uses that end phrase, kind of screws that theory up for me. So now I would say I don't totally know, but you guys talked a lot about brotherly relationships, and if you back it out another level, family relationships, and how much just isn't spoken despite the fact that you have known these people forever and you share such a bond with them. And I just liked the way that he was approaching that in what I felt was a very realistic element. And as far as like further motives and where this story goes from here, I guess a lot of times I don't necessarily worry about that. I think I'm like cool with living in the present of how that ends as this, basically this occurrence, this fictional moment that can kind of maybe put something in your own life into a not so fictional perspective as well. So I don't know.
But what is that ending then? So in that moment, what are you reading? Are you reading triumph? What are you reading into this ending in that moment?
Yeah, I'm reading, in keeping with like the brothers' pragmatism, I'm reading realistic human bonding, if that makes sense. Or rather, yeah, just like
acceptance almost.
Yeah, like I said, he's not so worried where Sonny's going to go from here, because he's learned something about Sonny that he has never been in the place to see before. And that is a useful thing that helps him break some of his previous sort of father figure advice and sort of negativity and disappointment. And while I think he would even say, if he had the opportunity, did this go further, that, maybe he's going to continue to be disappointed in Sonny. Maybe he's going to continue to not respect his decisions and whatnot. But I think at least at this point, he's letting go. And I think that's the moment that he experienced the emotion that Sonny feels in that music for the first time, truly. And I think that was like an eye-opener for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's at the very least a sense of understanding. And if you want to keep it in biblical terms, there's almost kind of a communion in that
right.
music.
With the scotch and milk, which, by the way, I had to look up to make sure that wasn't some disgusting thing. It sounds real gross, but people do it.
Oh, really? I thought it was I kept reading into that as like milk as this sort of life force and scotch as this poison. And
Scotch isn't that bad.
I mean, all alcohol is terrible for your body, and but doesn't mean it's not amazing and delicious.
No, apparently it's supposed to be good. I think we like a little bit of cinnamon or nutmeg on it or something.
If I may chime in.
Yeah, you got a nice recipe.
I think I mostly agree with Nick as far as like the reference was totally lost on me, and I read it as a poetic sort of biblical kind of language, but I didn't really sit with it at all. But the resolution to me, it seemed to me that very much the story was about understanding and about like having empathy for. I mean, in this is specifically for your siblings, but for somebody who makes such dramatically different choices from you, and is so easy to judge. And at the end of the story, he steps out of that judgment towards a more merciful place. I don't know. I see the cup of trembling. I'd have to look more into the analogy of what that exactly means. But like, I think maybe recognizing that they're all lost in a way. They're all wandering. They're all suffering, and recognizing that maybe Sonny's version of suffering is no better or no worse. Maybe he suffers for different reasons, or maybe he's feeling things more acutely, but it's it's a shared experience. And in this case, the music becomes the vehicle for sharing that experience, for crossing that boundary between two ways of life.
Yeah, this narrator finally is no longer detached from his suffering, and finds something in that music to express that. I don't mean to keep speaking in religious terms, but almost redemptive.
I guess when I read it, I saw him as like feeling Sonny's pain, feeling Sonny's suffering, feeling Sonny experiences life on a much broader spectrum. I think that's pretty clear, and like getting a glimpse of that spectrum and kind of admiring it. Instead of judging that he suffers so greatly, admiring that he also expresses himself so greatly. And I didn't read it as like Sonny leading the narrator towards a sort of redemption.
So let me read just a little bit of it, because I think maybe we can talk about that. Here's part of the end. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning we had yet to make it ours, how we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood, at last, that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. Yet there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through, and would continue to go through until he came to rest in earth. He had made it his, that long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy, and he was giving it back, as everything must be given back, so that passing through death it can live forever. And he goes on, and he sees his mother's swollen feet. He remembers his wife's tears at the death of his daughter, and he kind of talks a little bit about it. And then he says, "And I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside, as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky." And then he goes in to describe Sonny playing the piano in the very last line. He puts the drink back on top of the piano. And then he says, "For me then, as they began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling." I just think there's so much going on there. There's this idea of a release from pain, but only if you listen to something very... I'm not sure what he's trying to get at, actually, about listen to what exactly. Listen to other people's suffering, listen to how they escape that suffering, listen to the passion that they have.
Or is he talking specifically about artists? Is it possible that he's saying specifically the artist, in this case the musician, but maybe also the writer, or the painter, or the filmmaker, or whatever? Listen to the people who experience life extremely, and they can help you feel the pain that you don't know how to feel in yourself.
I'd agree with that. I don't know if I would say that there's kind of this idea that the artist has to live in extremes in order to be able to distill it back down for everyone else. And I don't totally agree with that, partially because it's a certain type of artist. But I think there is something with being able to communicate effectively in a way what that means, and kind of the age-old question, but you suffer, but why? And I think that's essentially exactly how he's wrapping it up, which is Sonny's maybe not answering that for people, but he's providing color to it. He's offering a context in which it allows people to bridge the gap and to start to think about that and to be reflective upon their own lives and suffering, all while, as you mentioned, David, in the quote, like the outside world just doesn't care. Like it's just going on, and it's your own thing that literally nobody cares about. And they will, you will be judged, you will be put in a line with everyone else, and nobody cares. But that doesn't make it any less powerful and any less of kind of one of, I don't know, the central themes of, like I said earlier, my favorite topic in fiction is just how do you get through this thing? It's hard.
Yeah. And that is it. Art is a way to help you handle your existential dread. So maybe Nathan's reading is actually all right then. When he was reading it, he thought it was good. And afterwards, the tiger was lurking for him, and life, did what it did. And he didn't have time for it anymore.
Actually, that's exactly what I was just feeling right now. I was like, shit, maybe I just don't have space for this kind of depth of feeling. I was like,
it's possible too.
I wanted to go, this is literally just going through my head. I was like, I want to go back to some punk concert in college and feel this again. I think I'm too much like the narrator. I'm just getting through it.
You're just an old dude that goes to work all the time.
And lives on a boat.
Yeah. A boat in the sky.
What?
I was trying to bridge the gap between Nathan living on a boat and the narrator living in a high rise. Didn't really work. But I like the idea of a boat in the sky.
I thought you were making a veiled threat
or a reference to heaven. Just could be a veiled threat depending on how you slice it.
Wait, how's that a threat?
Well, I mean, I'd have to be dead.
But you're going to be trapped.
But I appreciate that you think highly of me.
Ba-dum-dum.
So I don't know. Are we ready to sum it up?
Yeah, I guess in keeping with my theme of attacking Nathan the whole episode, I'm curious, has this changed anything?
I mean, one, it's really beautiful to hear quotes read from this story. And I feel like maybe I should have read it out loud. Maybe I would have appreciated it more.
They're kind of meant for the pulpit.
Yeah.
They really are.
Yeah, it feels like it. And I want to read it again, actually. I feel like maybe I just didn't spend enough time with it. It's definitely been fun to talk about. And it sounds like it's a really good story.
There's your soundbite. All right. Well, I'm glad that, some convincing has happened. Or maybe not even convincing, but you're right. I think about that idea all the time is is there even space to be able to comprehend some of these things that are being presented to me, whether it's in art or even just social concepts or things and I think that's a tricky thing in modern times with the speed of communication and everything. How do you make room to actually parse through stuff? And maybe that's the indirect argument for short fiction.
I mean, it's almost like poetry, it's really easy to read a poem and really easy to forget about it. Yeah, exactly. In poetry to me reminds me that I don't have space for beauty. And
another soundbite.
With a poem, if I read something or I want to get engaged with it, then I have to make time and space deliberately to do that. And I think maybe with short fiction, I am looking at it more like a novel, and the novel kind of, eventually forces you into it. You've spent so much time with it, a place in your brain's carved out, and a short story exists somewhere in between. Maybe I need to take a break, retire for a bit, spend a little bit of time, read slowly.
Yeah, we should all retire.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, let's do it, guys. And yeah, with Nathan's resounding endorsement of James Baldwin writing a pretty good story, we're going to check out another one of his supposedly pretty good stories for the next podcast, Giovanni's Room. Grab a copy. We'll have it released in about a month, and then we can dig into some more Baldwin and see where that leads.